Part 2. Kate. Chapter 11. It was late April in 1847 when Sam Minard came down from the mountains. Pelt-wise, he had had a full winter. He had found more top-quality beaver in one group of streams than he had ever found before. From the first week of his arrival he had trapped, but his finest pelts had been taken in February and March. He had trapped all day long, every day of the month, and even in night time, when the moon was full. Of first-class pelts, called a plus, and pronounced by the mountain men plu, he had 2.5 packs. Of inferior pelts, he had almost 3 packs, and he had about 50 otter. A typical day for him had run like this. At daylight he had stirred in his blankets and robes, back under the low branches of a pine, and had crawled out until he could stand. He came out of bed fully clothed. He had had no such feasts as he had had on the journey with his wife. His meat was jerked venison, lean elk, beaver tail, muskrat, together with flour and coffee. Sometimes a whole week passed with no fire. He was simply too busy. Working over the graining blocks and stretching frames took a lot of time. Every day he had to move his horses to spots where they could find forage, either along streams or in mountain meadows, where they could paw down through 3 or 4 feet of snow to old grasses. He spent hundreds of hours at the tiresome and painstaking task of dubbing, that is, of removing with pieces of sharpened elk horn or obsidian the fat, flesh, and blood from the pelts. He walked hundreds of miles back and forth on the streams, setting his traps and bringing the pelts in. Once in a while he made a fire and roasted a couple of beaver tails and made a pot of coffee. He took time to fill his pipe now and then. He had thought a great deal about his wife, and he had worried about her. He had had dreams about her that troubled him. As spring drew near, his worry became so chronic that he almost burst from the mountains to learn if she was all right. When at last he fought his way out along streams, over elk snow paths, or over paths which he had to break for his beasts, he tried to think of something at the posts which he could buy for her. If she was like most Indian women, she would want brightly colored cloths, beads, ornaments, and ribbons for her hair. He hoped she would prefer a handsome saddle with bridle and trimmings to match. He had a picture of her dressed like a Crow warrior in the finest embroidered buckskin, with long tassels and fringes, and a gorgeous headdress with its mass of feathers floating behind her in the wind. Their son would be in a saddle on her back, standing up, his bright, fearless eyes fixed with astonishment on everything he passed. By the time he was 4 or 5, he would have his own pony and would learn to ride like a crow, and he would have his own saddle, the finest, and his own buckskin clothing, with the prettiest beadwork the squaws could make. Sam liked to think of his son riding like a crow, not only because the crows were the best horsemen in the world. They made excellent weapons and were the most formidable fighters on the plains. At leatherwork and embroidery there were no women to match the Apsaraka. That is what the stupid French called them, the gens de corbeau, the Apsaraka, the sparrowhawk people. The Crow warriors were so brave that they went boldly against any people who invaded their lands, including their ancient enemies, the Blackfeet, and they seemed to feel friendly toward the white men, because the white men also loved to slaughter the ferocious Bloods and Piegans. The Crow nation boasted that it had never killed a white person or a friend of the white people. Sam was thinking of this boast as he followed the windbreaks down the canyons. He was to think afterward that he had had a sense of it miles before he reached the cabin. He called it his enemy sense. His enemy sense would have prompted him in any case to make a wary approach. As mountain man and fatalist, he had known all winter that his wife might be killed while he was away, that she could be killed, and indeed that he might be killed by man or beast. Riding toward her, he told himself that he might be ambushed for the pelts he carried. There developed in him a feeling that Indians had been through this country since he rode away. His guard was up, his senses were alert, and the nausea of loss and loneliness was sinking from his mind down through him, when a mile from the cabin he drew on the reins and then sat, feeling. He didn't like it at all. He secured his beast in an aspen thicket and went softly forward on moccasined feet, the rifle barrel across his left arm. On a hill above the river he came within sight of the cabin. There, well hidden, he peered out and held his breath. He could see the corral, but no sign of the pony. The cabin, with its door wide open, but no sign of his wife. He was beginning to feel desperately ill. He felt that she was not there, and if she was not there, he prayed to God that she had gone back to her people. If she was a red warrior's captive, she was now a slave in some village, beaten and cursed by the old shrews of the tribe. If she was a prisoner, he would find her, if it took all the years of his life. His gaze searched the aspen hillside that sloped down to the cabin from the east, and the river bottomlands to the south and the north. He looked everywhere for a snow trail. Convinced at last that his wife was not there, and with grief and rage rising in a hot flood all through him, he went forward. But instead of approaching directly from the west, he flanked the cabin and came in from the east, a soundless stalker among the trees. When 100 yards from the cabin, he paused and tried to feel the situation. He prayed that she was in the cabin and alive, but logic told him that Indians were more likely to be there, waiting for him. He went forward again until he came to the rear wall and put an ear to a seam between logs and listened. Then, his rifle cocked, his finger on the trigger, his knife loosened in its sheath, he slipped around the corner and along the north wall. He was peering round the northwest corner for a glimpse of the doorway, when, with a start that shook him clear to his feet, he saw the objects before him. In an instant of recognition that convulsed him worse than illness or nightmare could have done, Sam knew what had happened. He was holding his breath. He felt faint. There before the open door and scattered round about were the bones of his wife. Without moving and without feeling now, for he had been completely numbed, he looked at them and all around them for perhaps 5 long minutes. He saw bones that had been picked clean by crows and magpies, and when he advanced, at last, he saw 100 feet distant the skull. The scalp had been so completely taken that there was only a little hair across the nape. He went forward until he could look down, and then stared at the eye sockets, at the holes that were the ears, at the marks of hatchet or knife in the bone of the skull. Then swiftly he entered the cabin. There was nothing in it. The murderers had taken everything. Still drawing only half-breaths, and still feeling faint, he knelt among the bones and saw what until this moment he had missed. As gently, as if reaching for a butterfly, he picked up an object, set his rifle by the wall, and laid the object across a palm. It was the skull of a baby. He now saw, on looking round, that scattered among his wife's bones were the bones of his child. He took up one after another to look at them. His first glance had told him that his wife had been dead no more than 10 days or 2 weeks. Sick with grief and remorse, he was telling himself over and over that if he had come in 2 weeks ago, she would now be alive. She had been sitting there, on the log he had placed for her. The dear, faithful thing had been looking across the river and into the west for a sign of his coming. She had been sewing leather clothing, looking and sewing and looking. Her rifle had stood by the wall at her left. Her knife was in its sheath, and the revolver at her waist. And the pony staked on the river bottom had surely been out of sight, or it would have given an alarm. She had been so intent on trying to see him, or on pushing the needle through the leather, that she hadn't heard the soft footfalls. And around the corner had come a red killer, and he had been above her before she sensed his presence. With one blow he had almost severed her head low on the neck. He had scalped her and stripped her of everything she had on, and she had lain there, dead, with a baby, his son, kicking and dying inside her. Lord God Almighty, this vengeance would be his. His deeply tanned face drained to a sickly grey. He looked north and northeast, knowing that the killer had had to come in that way. In a few minutes he would find a sign of him, and he would know from what tribe he had come. Sam gathered every bone he could find. A few had been dragged 50 yards or more from the cabin, and he then sat on the earth and putting them all in his lap, looking down at them. After a few minutes he knew that his eyes had blurred. He hadn't known that tears were so hot. He could recall no moment from all his years when he had wept. He pressed the skull of Lotus to one cheek, his son's to the other, and sat, trying to think of what he should do. But he knew what he would do. When at last he gently put the bones aside and rose to his feet, he was dizzy with rage so blindly murderous that he reached for his rifle and failed to find it. He struck at his eyes, but they were clogged with grief. Never before in his life had he felt such dreadful pain and loss and loneliness. He stood, trying to see, and began to wipe at his eyes. And when he could see and had the rifle in his grasp, he stood still, letting his fury grow, until it filled his whole frame and made him ache to be on his way. As he sensed more deeply his loss and the fantastic cowardice of the killer, he could think only of vengeance. The years before him became as clear as they would have been if he had had a time map. But first he had to gather what remained of his wife and child, and then search the area to determine which tribe was guilty. While walking here and there around the cabin, over to the river and back, he realized that there had been a light snowfall since his family was slain. Seeing a mark like a shadow, he would reach into the snow and bring up another bone. From the thicket he brought his beast and took from a pack horse a blanket. Within this he put the bones, and wrapped and tied the bundle, and made it secure behind his saddle. He found a needle that Lotus had dropped. Had she been making a jacket for him, a shirt, or moccasins, or something for the child, at the moment the tomahawk fell across her neck? From what tribe had the killer come? Sam thought he must be from the Comanches, the ferocious varmints who had cut Jed Smith down with knives and hatchets. Round and round the cabin he went, inside and out, sniffing, but he could detect no Indian odor, nor could he find any sign in the cabin or around it. So he took their snow trail up the river, and at the junction of the Little Snake with the Yampa, he sat on his horse and looked round him. From this point the path went up the Snake. He hardly knew what to make of it. If it had been the Comanches, they would have struck off to the east, south of Battle Mountain. He calculated it was not the Comanches after all. He knew it was not when, after a journey of 2 days up the river, he came to an Indian campsite that had been protected by heavy trees from the recent storm. It was on a U-band of the stream, and on 3 sides it had such dense windbreak and snowbreak that the ashes of their fire had been undisturbed by wind and storm. A few moccasin tracks were in the clay under a high bank. Sam didn't know the moccasin print of the Comanche, but he knew that of the Crow, as well as he knew his own. These prints seemed to have been made by crows, but this he found so incredible that he studied them with extreme care and searched round them for corroborating evidence. There could be no doubt of it. The red men who had camped here had been crows. The crows who boasted that they had never harmed a white man or his friend. The crows who with the mountain men waged war against the Blackfeet. Sam was remembering now that for 200 or 300 miles he had ridden with Lotus through Crow country. Perhaps the one who had tried to steal his Bowie had trailed him, or perhaps it had been a war party of foolhardy youngsters eager to count a coup and kill. Because there had been no trace of his snowpath of last November and no sign of him anywhere, they had not known where to look for him, and so had slain his wife and fled with her horse, weapons, bedding, and food. One of them had her scalp, and would have it until Sam Minard found him and cut him wide open and flung his cowardly liver to the wolves. He would find that killer before he died, so help him God. Over on his right, as he took his way up the river, were mountains with peaks that rose 11,000 feet above the sea. As he approached the mountains, Sam studied their snowy summits and the forest blanketed with white, wondering how high up those flanks he could climb, for he wanted to swear an oath of vengeance somewhere high above the earth. The snow up there in the pale sky haze might be 15 feet deep, but on the north side it ought to hold him. He would hide his beasts and fur packs in the foothills, and with his rifle and a little food he would climb as high as he could. From the base of the peaks it was only a few thousand feet to their summits, but it might take a man a week to get there. While wondering if he should be so romantic and foolish, Sam thought of the lovely flowers that would now be blooming on the southern slopes below the snow line. He would climb at least that far, and when at last he stood far up in a night world, silent but for the winds, with the scent of flowers around him, he held fragrant bloom to his face, remembering the hours when he had put lupin and columbines and roses in her hair, and hung a mantle of flowers from her shoulders. What a lovely thing she had been when her eyes looked out from the wreath that framed her face and her lips smiled. Half the night he waited for the golden lamp to rise out of the grey murk of the east. He was ready when his moment came. Standing on a crag of wind-swept precipice, his rifle at his left side, he looked up at the stars and the blue-grey of the first morning. When half the golden lamp was in sight, he spoke. He asked the Almighty Father to look down on him in his trouble and his grief. Never in his life had he raised a hand against the Crow people, but he had been their friend. Yet when he was gone, they came like wolves in the night to kill his wife and child. They had known that this girl was a white man's wife. They had known that she was alone, 1,000 miles from her people and a long way from her man. She never had a chance to defend herself. There she sat, a baby in her, sewing on a shirt for her man or for her child, or looking into the west for a sign of her man. And without a moment of warning, they had chopped her down. And there she had lain in the yard, dead, with her baby dying inside her, there for the wolves and the magpies and ravens. He paused there, wondering if he had said enough. There was more that he had wanted to say that in the Holy Book it said that vengeance was God's, but that in this case it was Sam Minard's. To say that he intended to make war, single-handed and alone, against the whole skulking, cowardly Crow nation. To say, from where I now stand until the day I die, I swear upon the bones of my slain wife and child that I will kill every Crow warrior that crosses my path. That was it. That was what he had wanted to say. Was there something else? There had been words from Job that his father had read at breakfast one morning, that his eyes did shine and were like the eyes of the morning, or something like that. He had intended to shake his clenched fist at the Crow nation and hurl into the listening night such words of power and fury as would make the peaks tremble. But after coming to the flowers and remembering the flower hours, and her eyes and smile, a gentleness of the morning or of heaven had touched him. And so he stood on the crag, his face to the morning sky, and became aware of himself as a man who had sworn a terrible oath of vengeance. Never had he really hated any man, or wished to kill any man, but this had been forced on him, and only the coward would blanch from it and turn back. The eyes of the morning, that was all he would need, and a little help from divine justice in the right places. And so he stood, the male on the mountain peak, making his vow of vengeance, and 800 miles north the female knelt in her tiny graveyard before the angelic faces of her slain ones, and uttered a prayer to the same Father. The sun was an hour high, and the atmosphere a pale golden above the white, when Sam turned down the mountain. He had gathered a whole armful of the lovely alpine lilies. On his way down, he tried to lay his plans. He would take his pelts to Bridger and pay for the things he had bought, and the remainder he would take to the Laramie post, for that was close to Crow country. He would buy a faster horse, if there was one, for there would be times when he would ride for his life. He would buy another bowie, for there might be times in close fighting when he would need to lay their bellies open, right and left. He knew well that as soon as he had killed a few crows, every warrior in the nation would dedicate himself to his death. He would need a few of the toughest hides to make moccasins for his horse to be put on when he approached an enemy camp, and he would need twice as much powder and ball as he had ever bought before. As he went down the mountain flank, he came to other flowers, creamy white with yellow centers, that he thought almost as lovely as the lilies. To make a basket, he stripped off his leather shirt, and inside this he carried a bushel of flowers. On returning to his hidden beasts, he took the bundle from behind the saddle, opened it, and literally wrapped and smothered the bones in flowers. The hair on the nape of the skull he kissed. Then, tenderly, with large clumsy hands, he folded the bones and flowers within the blanket and made the bundle secure behind his saddle. During these moments, he was thinking not of Loretto, but of Milton Sublette, who in a fight with the half-breed John Gray had been stabbed so mortally that his associates, thinking he would die, had left him in the care of Joe Meek. Milton had got well, and soon thereafter he and Joe had fallen into the hands of a party of hostile Indians. They would have been killed but for a chief and his lovely daughter, who in the dark of night had helped them to escape. Smitten by the girl, Milton not long thereafter had married her. Leaving her in the mountains, as Sam had left Lotus, Milton had gone east on a business trip and had died on his return journey. And within a year or two, his wife was shot down by the Bannock Indians. This Indian girl, Meek had said, was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. But not, Sam told himself, as beautiful as Lotus. While riding northwest to the Bridger post, Sam decided that if he were to live another year, much less 5 or 10, he would do well to map a plan of attack. This thought led him to a long and careful appraisal of the nature of his enemies. There were some curious advantages on his side. The white man was far more adult than the red man, who, in fact, was only a child in his emotions, impulsive, hot-headed, and by turns craven or reckless. The white man, faced with danger, decided instantly and acted swiftly. The red man was in some measure inhibited by his burden of superstitions, and had to wait on medicine men and propitious signs. The white man had no boss, no chief. The red man was the servile creature of ritual and ceremonial. He spent a part of his life in such monkey business as touching the earth with the bowl of his pipe and then turning the stem upwards to invoke medicine magic. Even so, the red man thought the white man as brainless, and vacant as the fool hen, as slow as the turtle, and as gullible as the antelope. Why, he asked, did the white man put the centers of logs in his fires instead of the ends? Look, there they were, hours later, with the centers burned out and the ends lying on either side of a dying fire. It was true, Sam had decided, that the white man was buffalo-witted in some ways. Well, one fact to keep in mind was this, that if 60 red men faced an enemy, every single one of them would figure that if one and only one of his party was killed, he would be the dead man. If 2 were killed, or 3 or 5, he would be one of them. It was for this reason that the warriors of most tribes would turn and run after 1 or 2 or 3 had been killed. The white man, on the other hand, figured that if only 1 of 60 were to die, the odds were 59-1 in his favor. He was likely to think the odds greater than that, for the reason that he didn't look on himself as an average fighter. On arriving at Bridger's post, Sam was so sunk in brooding and plotting that he carried a part of his pelts in, asked for a reckoning, and turned to leave. Jim's strange eyes had been studying him. Jim called out, "I don't see hide nor hay your wife." Sam turned. "She's dead." "How'd that happen?" asked Jim, showing no astonishment. "Crows." Jim took a few moments to consider that, and then followed Sam outside. "Certainly not the crows, Sam." Bridger had in mind that Beckworth and Rose had been crow chiefs, and that a number of the free trappers had taken crow women. His eye said he didn't think the crows had done it. "The crows," Sam said, cinching up his packs. "I just can't believe it. Did you find plenty sign?" "Plenty." To change the subject, Jim said, "Black Harry's was here. Says 1,000,000 Mormons is coming through this summer. All back there on Misery Bottoms, getting their wagons ready." Sam was no longer interested in Mormons and Brigham Young and his wives. "Here's another thing," said Jim, trying to get Sam to talk. "Lots of the boys are meeting up at Laramie 'bout now. They might know if the Crows done it. There is Powder River Charlie." Sam said, "For what I have coming, give me credit. What's your topknot, Jim?" "Just a minute," said Jim. He walked over to Sam and looked at Sam's eyes. "You're kinda young. You intend to go inter the Crow country?" "Right through the middle of it," Sam said. "I wouldn't do that, Sam. You intend to fight the whole nation?" "The whole nation." Jim was still looking at Sam's eyes. He put forth a gnarled hand and said, "I reckon then I best give you a handshake, for I don't 'spect I'll see you again." "I figure you will," Sam said, and clasped the hand. From Bridgers on Black's Fork, he rode east and north to Green River, then east and north to South Pass, the Sweetwater, and the Oregon Trail, which he followed east to the Laramie post, where he would trade for supplies and, if lucky, a fast horse. On this long ride he tried to lighten his mood by singing songs, but the only one that would rise from his depths was "Sorrow, Sorrow, Stay." He couldn't sing "To Celia" any more, or "When Laura Smiles," or a dozen others, for there rose before him the picture of his girl wife on that long, sweet journey south, and he would reach behind him to touch the blanket that enfolded the bones and flowers. A few of the free trappers were at the post, and, after their long, lonely winter, they were eager to swap talk. But Sam didn't want to talk. Lost Scalp Dan came over to him. Dan was a big man. He stood a good 6'2" in moccasins and weighed 220. He had large, full, pale blue eyes that were cold and mean, but that had a light touch of warmth when he looked at Sam. Dan had heard that Sam's wife had been killed, though how he had heard it, Sam was never to know, for no rider had passed him on the trail. Dan wanted to express sympathy, but he was clumsy and tactless. He did manage to say at last, "Sam, ever need any help, just holler." "Thanks," Sam said. He would never holler. What he wondered was whether Crows at this post had talked about the death of Lotus. Mick Boone was there, and Mick had also heard about it. All the trappers knew that Mick had one of the fastest horses in the West, a big strong bay with the lines of a racer. Mick first asked Sam if he would join him in a drink. Sam thanked him and said he never drank. "Bad habit," Mick said, and put on the queer smile he had when self-conscious. It took him a few moments to get the words out. He said he figured as how Sam might like to use his bay for a while. Sam looked into Mick's brown eyes and said, "I couldn't take your bay." "Not a thing to stop you," Mick said. "If you aim to ride plumb through Crow country, and I figure you do, you'll need a fast horse, or you might never reach the other side." "You might be right," Sam said. "I'll change the saddles," Mick said. So Mick took the stud, and Sam set off on the big bay. The news would spread fast that the Crows had killed Sam Menard's wife and unborn child, and that after declaring war on the whole nation, Sam was showing what kind of business he meant by riding clear across it, alone. When he rode away into the north, Sam was not thinking of that. He was again thinking of the nature of his enemies. The vast plains and mountains area, which they claimed as their own and fought to hold, lay chiefly upon the southern drainage of the Yellowstone, upon its tributaries, the Bighorns, the Rosebud, and the Powder, and the Tongue. The heart of the Crows was the Valley of the Bighorns, though they claimed the lands lying in all directions from these rivers to a considerable distance. Sam had heard it said by some of the older trappers that the Crows had the finest bodies of all the red men, that they were the handsomest and the ablest hunters and the most expert thieves, and that of all the red warriors they were the deadliest shots with the white man's weapons. The American Fur Company had built 4, the Missouri Fur Company 2 posts, solely for their convenience in trading. It saddened Sam to think that these people had made him their enemy, for he had been a little enchanted by them. 400 Crow lodges on the move was a remarkable spectacle in rhythm and color. The warriors in their richly ornamented robes, with floating and flowing fringes and feathers and headpieces, and with the principal squaws in really elegant mantles and cloaks of bird skins, spangled over with beads. Standing upon the mothers' backs were 100 papooses in cradles as richly ornamented as the mother's garments. The children swathed tight but standing, their bright black eyes expressing joy in life. Behind the procession or ahead of it or on its flanks were hundreds of ponies under huge burdens, as well as hundreds of dogs, so covered over with camp litter that almost no part of them was visible. From a distance it looked as if a prairie of brilliant colors was flowing in a gentle wind. Well, it was by their own cowardice and brutality that Sam Menard was their enemy now. Mick, like Bridger, had acted as if he doubted that the Crows had done it. But Sam knew the print of the Crow moccasin. The Cheyennes, Arapahoes, and Comanches all had an inside straight edge on their cowskin moccasins, and the point so turned as to give the wearer the appearance of being pigeon-toed. The Pawnee moccasin looked for all the world as if the Indian had placed his foot in the center of a piece of buckskin and then pulled all the edges to the top of the foot in front of the ankle, with the rear part brought up behind the leg and tied round with leather string. The Crow moccasin, like their clothing, was so expertly tanned and made that its print was skin-smooth in every part of it, with no sign of the little bulges and irregular seams that marked most of the others. He had examined with the utmost care a dozen footprints. To one who had made a study of the prints of different tribes, the Crow print was as plain and as unlike any other as their manner of cutting their hair. The Cheyennes and Utahs wore their hair in long loose locks, cut off close above the brows, so that vision would not be obscured. The Pawnees and Kansas shaved the front and back, leaving only a topknot at the crown, which was so stiff with grease and grime that it stood up straight and barely wavered in a wind. The Blackfeet usually confined their hair in 2 long braids. The Crows, more artistic in hairdress than any of the others, arranged their hair to harmonize with their elaborate and colorful headdress. Maybe Mick and Jim hadn't made a study of footprints. Maybe they didn't know that the Crows were more nomadic than any other tribe. It wasn't unusual for these skulking thieves to be seen 1,000 miles from their central village, for with their faster horses they could easily outrun their pursuers. Most of the red people occupied settlements that were more or less fixed, in the center of which might be a big lodge of buffalo skins painted red and tattooed with the secret and magic totems of the tribe. Not far from the central station there might be a scalp pole from which the scalps, some dried and shrunken, some still wet and bloody, flapped in the winds. The scalp pole was the visible measure of a nation's heroism. Near it was another pole, from which hung the medicine bags with their strange and potent contents. Sam, like most of the mountain men, had made a study of totems, because from the nature of the totem could be inferred the character of the people. The eagle, wolf, bear, fox, serpent, wolverine, hawk. Though Sam had concluded that the choice of totem was largely determined by the kind of country the tribe occupied. The skins of totems were often to be seen stuffed and set up in conspicuous places for worship. All the tribes Sam had visited seemed to be, in the way of small children, fond of strong, bright colors, particularly red, yellow, vermilion, and blue. Sometimes, for black, as a medicine color, they used the scraped-off powder of charred wood mixed with gunpowder, if they had it. White men had laughed themselves into exhaustion when told the story of the brave who smeared his entire body with gunpowder and moved close to a fire and exploded. This was the same reckless warrior who had eaten buffalo tongue at a time when it was taboo to him, and had so paralyzed the whole village with terror that to save his people and himself he had thrust and pulled his tongue out so far that the roots of it were almost in the front of his mouth. At the same time he had bellowed with such rage and pawed the earth into such dust clouds as he snorted and heaved that he had cast off the malevolent spell and returned his people to safety and calm. Few things had more astonished Sam and the other trappers, or brought from them more vigorous expression of contempt, than the red man's fanatical devotion to a mysterious and intricate system of ceremonial and magic. The Indian's world was so overrun by evil spirits and wicked powers that there were times when he was immobilized. He couldn't shoot a rabbit, or make a fire, or put on his war paint without first engaging in his mystical and propitiating grunts and gestures. There was his pipe, which he passed in solemn supplication to all the directions and to every conceivable thing, including sun, moon, winds, and sky. He had many symbols attached to his lodges, utensils, and war tools. No hunting party, no war party, no journey could be undertaken, no lodge could be built or buffalo robe made, and no planting could be strewn in its furrows or harvest gathered without first going through his interminable childish rituals. This gave to enemies an advantage they were quick to seize. Now and then a band of warriors was attacked when by magic and conjuration and thaumaturgy it was simply helpless and useless and not able to fight. Sam was thinking that now and then he might catch a few of them without their medicine bags and find it as easy to knock them over as to knock over full hands. His grief was so hot and his hatred so black that he didn't care if, when he fell on them, they were not prepared to fight. He intended to shoot them and knife them and knock their heads off, as undisturbed by their cries as a wolf seizing a rabbit. Looking round him at the miracle of spring, listening to the arias of bluebird and meadowlark, gathering early flowers to press into the blanket, and thinking over and over of the joy with which he had looked forward to riding north with his wife, he actually turned pale with suppressed furies and promised himself that a dozen scalps would dangle from his saddlebags within a month. To show his contempt, he might even collect and display an assortment of their medicine bundles, such as the stuffed heads of wolves, or the skin, claws, teeth, and feathers of various birds and beasts, whose virtues the absurd creatures believed they had assimilated. Still, Windy Bill had said that they were no more ridiculous than those white people who partook of different sacraments. Above all, Sam wanted them to know who was about to strike when they heard his cry, who had killed a warrior when they found the flesh and bones. So he decided, while riding along, to leave his mark on every dead brave, a mark that the whole Crow nation would recognize as his mark. The whole nation would also know his battle cry. He wished he had a trumpet. If only he could drive the whole damned Crow people into mourning or lunacy. That would be a sight to ennoble the heart, equal to Napoleon and his ragged army hurled back from Moscow. A crow, when mourning and lamenting a slain or mortally wounded warrior, hacked at nearly all parts of his body, and sometimes cut off one or more fingers. What gouts of blood he would make flow! In what rivers of blood he would avenge his wife and child! How the men, women, and children, the whole nation, all of them, would set up a wild, dismal howling and quavering and shrieking that would curdle the blood of a loon or a wolf. If 10 braves came forth to take him, as a war party had once gone forth to take a Blackfeet chief, with none and nothing ever returning, except the moccasin-carrying pack dogs, what an infernal, sky-filling bedlam of rage and frustration the Crow nation would be! It over-enjoyed him to think of it. It would be like the time Jim Clyman told of a camp gone wild and stark mad with woe after looking on a scene of slaughter. How the women and children had torn at their flesh and screamed, with all around them the frenzied howling of dogs, the insane neighing and braying of horses and mules, the mournful hooting of owls, and over it all the horrible sickening stench of grief and sweat and dung and warm blood and mingled coyote and dog odors. The Crow war whoop, hook-kai-hi, that had raised the hair on Sioux, Blackfeet, and Cheyenne, and made the goose-flesh swarm down their backs, would be stilled in a lot of throats. A lot of braves, now strutting in their gaudy war paints and battle dress, would count coup no more. Coup, which in this land was pronounced coup, in the French way, was the highest heroism an Indian warrior could aspire to. To count coup, he had to strike an enemy with his quirt, or bow, or knife, or coup stick before he attacked him, or he had to take from the enemy all his weapons, or he had to slip up a foot and steal the horse of an enemy tied to his own lodge. There were a lot of ways to touch coup, all of them devised to show more than ordinary courage. After a warrior had counted coup, he had the right to wear the eagle feather in his hair, and another thereafter for each coup he made. If he were so clumsy or frightened while attempting a coup that he received a wound, he had to wear a feather painted red. Sam had seen a Crow chief with 7 feathers in his hair. Against one of such valor he doubted that he would ever have a chance. To bring him down, the nation would send only the young warriors who are the bravest, fleetest, and deadliest, or the most adept in stratagems, such as tracking and ambush. Let them come, the cowardly, unspeakable murderers of a lone woman and her unborn child. Let the chiefs and those who were battle-hardened, who had waged war against the Lakota or Sioux, the striped feather arrows, or Cheyennes, the tattooed breasts or Arapahoes. Let them all come. Let even the pine leaves come. A legend said that Pine Leaf, when only 12 years old, lost a brother in battle, and thereupon vowed that she would never marry or do a woman's work until she had killed 100 of the enemy. Sam didn't know if she had killed any or what had become of her, or indeed if such a girl had lived. And there was the squaw named She Could Be Dead, whose man had been slain. She then became as crazy as two wildcats, with their tails tied together, mounting a pony, and armed only with bow and arrows and knife, she had gone forth alone against the Cheyennes. Nobody seemed to know what became of her, but in legends there she was, riding forever, at great speed across the plains and ravines, her bronzed face smeared with red ochre, her arrows tipped with lightning, flashing into the foe's breast. Sam had heard at least a dozen stories of the furious, intrepid assaults of red women whose men had been killed. Now and then, a tale said, one of them returned from the warpath, her face as black as night, as a sign that she had triumphed over the enemy. His weeks with Lotus had acquainted him with the spirit and daring of the Indian girl. He wished, while riding along and making plans, or pausing to target shoot with his revolvers, that he had a good knowledge of the Crow tongue, so that he could hurl abominable and shocking insults at the moment of striking. Powder River Charlie spoke the language as well, he said, as the Crows themselves. He liked to make fun of them by translating what he had heard them say.
In the morning this old woman, her garden, when she come, and to it got, was all pulled up. This old woman it was. What I wonder is this, come and to it got, was all pulled up. What I wonder is this, said she, all the time critters, none whatever get to me truly. This what is it that me has got to? The tracks small were they, when looked at them she. Bad critters thought she bad. This old woman this night, she laid down, she prayed. When morning come, then the garden in she hid. Them there bad men, them she wanted to catch. Time passed more time. Moon come, moon sick, moon gone. This which she hid in the garden, what she took back, this old woman, there was nothing. This old woman over there, foot she puts away in hollow tree. Then come time, this old woman was not. There she wherever she went to. In the garden always there is none, no none.
The food she stored in the holler tree, its eater did she kill?
Doggone, don't ask me.
Charlie would sit by a campfire and suck at his pipe and roll his pale eyes from face to face and say,
There that and this here wind comes, on him it falls, it kills him. When close to it he run and came. When fast he went he was under it fast. When this wind it come crashed was he.
That, he said, was word-by-word translation of crow talk. He would knock his pipe out, refill it, and say,
"Now over there 10 sleep, some bad ones there are. Sleep they do not, hate you they do, kill you they will, scalp you ghosts like these warriors are slinking no sound to make, none. There their knives, they take out all around your neck. Off they chop. All woman running she comes, but save you she cannot. Her head chopped off it will be."
"Don't they never stop for a breath?"
"They never seem to. They talk like children talk. And let me tell you, don't never call them crows. They think you call them that because the crows they steal from bird nests, and they say they never steal, not ever, never."
"They're doggone liars," someone said.
"The Apsaraki, that's what they are. The Sparrowhawk people."
From Charlie and others, some had picked up a few words and phrases. Xatsisa, which he pronounced Zatsiso, meant "do not move." Daiwape Wimatsiki, which he rendered as Daiwapi Wimi Tesiki, meant "I will kill you." Riding along, he recalled that phrase and strove to master it and fix it in mind. But what he needed was words of insult and contumely that would freeze their marrow and glaze their blood. He now remembered Baiai Kia Waku, which meant "I will look out for me," and Darakida Raksta, "Don't you know your own child?" Then there came from one of Charlie's garrulous evenings, Karik, meaning old women. Charlie had called it Kariki, or something like that. He would hurl it at them. He would crush the bones in their necks, drive his knife through their livers, and kick them so hard in their spines that their heads would fall backwards and across their rumps. If only he could call them sick, cowardly old women crawling in the sagebrush. The red man had a child's fondness for insulting words. Sam had heard the story of Jess Danvers, who, with his 5 or 6 free trappers, was crossing the plains from one river to the next when suddenly, with no warning at all, his party was surrounded by Sioux warriors, crawling toward them sagebrush by sagebrush. The Indians were less than 200 yards from Jess when a chief stood up and, making a sign of peace, approached Jess and his men. As he drew near, he made more signs of peace and told Danvers that he and his men, the Long Knives, had been burning the wood of Sioux land and killing their game and eating their grass. The old rascal, stuffed full of guile, said he knew that Jess had come to pay for these things, with his horses, weapons, tobacco, with everything that he and his men had. He was Chief Fierce Bear, whose tongue was short, but whose lance was long. He preferred to speak with his weapons rather than jabber like a woman. With hostile gestures, he again said that the Long Knives had robbed his people blind, and would now pay with their horses, weapons, tobacco, everything they had. If they were not paid at once, his braves would get blood in their eyes, and he'd not be able to control them. In that case, they would take not only the horses, weapons, tobacco, and all the clothing, but they would take their scalps and possibly their lives. By this time Danvers was so choked with rage that he could barely speak. He said, in signs and words, and with furious gestures, that his heart was big, and the hearts of his men were big, but not toward those who threatened while pretending to be friends. If they were to give their horses and weapons, it would be to brave men, and not to a band of cowardly, limping, bent-over squaws crawling on their bellies like snakes in the sagebrush. He and his men were not French engagés, or toothless old women eating bugs, or sick dogs and coyotes, but fearless warriors with rifles that never missed fire, and knives that were always driven straight through the heart. The creatures yonder in the sagebrush, crawling on their bellies and with sand in their eyes, looked to him like sick old women hunting le bois de vache. Wah! Chief Fierce Bear then took his turn at insults. He said that Danvers and his men had killed so much of the game, cropped so much of the forage, and burned so much of the wood on Sioux land that the children were so hungry and feeble they couldn't stand. The women shook with moans and laments all day, and not 5 horses in the whole nation could rise to their feet. He and his warriors had loved peace. They had never killed a man, but if he and his braves were to be treated as if they were sick coyotes, and if they were to be robbed, it would be by brave fighters and not by coughing and sneezing palefaces. He and the men with him were the bravest on earth. They had only scorn for long rifles and knives in the hands of womanish creatures who had turned pale the first time they faced a foe, and had never got their color back. He would say again, and for the last time, that the blood in his men was hot, and their honor was crying for vengeance. The horses, weapons, tobacco, all these were to be delivered at once. According to the tale told by trappers, Danvers and the chief swapped insults for an hour or more, and then, backing off, each returned to his men. The battle commenced at once. Danvers was shot through the lungs, and suffered so from hemorrhage that he could only stagger around, unable to use his weapons or to speak, able only to stand helpless, while he exploded torrents of blood from his mouth and nostrils. Only one white man escaped to tell the story. Sam's mind again wandered to Windy Bill and Bridger and Charlie and their tales, and suddenly out of campfire and tobacco smoke and evening odors there came as sharp and clear as his mother's farewell these words: "Old woman's men, her children, their ghosts, there in the blackest night, they are in the sagebrush, they are crying." Those words, known to every free trapper in the mountains, had surely been sent down by the Almighty for the woman on the mussel shell. Sam looked north across Crowland. How was she now? After he had taken a few scalps, he would go up to see. Chapter 12. By the time he reached the middle fork of Powder River, Sam had become as wary as an Indian. Just ahead were the southern foothills of the Bighorns. He was undecided whether to swing west and go down the Bighorn Valley or straight north between the Bighorns and Powder River and on to Tongue River, which had its source in the Bighorn Mountains. After hiding his beasts in a thicket and making a fireless camp, he considered the matter. What he wanted to know was where most of the crows were at this time of year. Too lazy, or maybe too restless, to cultivate the soil, they were wandering people, always on the move. While eating stale jerked meat and thinking, Sam heard the warbling aria of a purple finch. Lord, hearing birdsong put hot grief all through his blood and bones. How many times on the long journey south had they stood together, his arms to her shoulders, while listening to the singer, or the robin, the vireo, the vesper sparrow, the lark. Taking his mind off song and putting it on vengeance, he wished his first triumph might be the death of a chief. That would be a coup to raise the hair of the nation. He had heard that one of their boldest younger chiefs was River of Winds, whose medicine bundle was the weasel, the ferocious killer of the gentle prairie dogs. He had an image of the Crow people, the whole 5,000 or 6,000 of them, shaking in a national convulsion as they filled the sky with their blood-chilling morning howl. It was the women who shrilled the loudest. Their infernal noise was so wild and savage that they turned a white man's blood to water. When with their hideous incantations they tried to terrify the evil spirits, they silenced even the wolf. Sam had once seen a large village in which was a mortally wounded warrior. Instead of allowing the poor devil in his agony to lie on the fur side of a robe and die in such peace as he could find, the women had dragged him all over the place, while blood flowed from a dozen wounds, and dogs lapped it up, while with beating of drums, and pounding of kettles, and blowing on reeds, and flinging piercing yells and shrieks at the sky, they made his last hour on earth a perfect nightmare. They were frightening the evil spirits away. Sam had no doubt that they had. If the squaws were to enter hell, all the creatures there would flee before them. This evening, as on every evening, since leaving the Laramie post, he examined his weapons. On stone and soft leather he had honed his knives, until they could mow the hair on his arms. His revolvers and rifle were oiled, loaded, and in perfect order. His wiping stick, used to force the ball down the rifle barrel, was of tough hickory, and the best he had ever seen. He didn't intend to use his rifle in close fighting, or his handguns either. In a close fight, you couldn't shoot fast enough or straight enough. Jim Bowie had taught them all that with a knife you could lay open 3 assassins before you could shoot one. A man's heels, knees, fists, and elbows were faster and more deadly than a gun in close quarters. With a blow of his heel, driven by powerful leg muscles, Sam could break a man's spine. With his 2 large hands on a throat, he could in an instant so completely shatter the neck that the head would fall over toward the backbone. He felt able to take care of himself in a close fight with as many as 4 or 5 red men, if he had the advantage of surprise. But he thought it might be smart to call on Powder River Charlie. He didn't like Charlie the way he liked most of the mountain men. He felt that this tall, sly, awkward-moving trapper had been born with larceny and murder in his heart. Charlie seemed always to be boiling for a fight, as though his honor had just been impeached or his mother insulted. 3 or 4 of the trappers had pale blue eyes that looked half popped out, but none had such bulging, ferocious eyes as Charlie. The moment you met his gaze, there was a change in his eyes. They seemed to swell and to move a little out of their caves and to fill to overflowing with the lightnings of challenge. But Charlie might know which Crow warriors had gone south to the Little Snake. He had his own private hideout back in the Bighorns, with a sheltered foothills meadow that gave forage to his beasts. There were excellent trapping streams all around him. He was in Crow country. He was right in the middle of it. But he was their friend. He had had 2 or 3 crow wives, though still a youngish man. Charlie had known such white crow chiefs as Rose and Beckworth, and he was a friend of John Smith, one of the most eccentric of the mountain men. It was said that Charlie and John used to foregather on a Sunday to sing pious songs and make reverent gestures toward the Father. Though Windy Bill said they were the most sanctimonious pair of hypocrites and the meanest varmints and the most inexplicable mixture of caution and foolhardiness, of goodwill and venomous hostility to be found in the mountains. It was said that Smith had lived for a while with the Blackfeet, then with the Sioux, then with the Cheyennes, taking wives in all 3 tribes. It was also said that he could turn the air to a sulphur blue, cursing in English, Spanish, and 4 Indian languages. Sam had never seen the man. While thinking about Charlie, there came to Sam the one tale of the many told about him that he liked best. Riding into camp one evening, leading a pack mule, Charlie had wanted to unpack the beast close to the fire, but when he pulled on the leather rope to bring the mule forward, the mule, most stubborn of all critters, laid his ears back and sank toward the earth at the rear end. Charlie had then wrapped his end of the rope twice around his waist, and like a horse in harness, he had tried to surge forward and take the mule with him. But the mule, if he moved at all, moved backwards, with his rump drawing closer to the earth. Charlie by this time was getting up the insane fury for which he was famous. Dashing back to the sulking mule, whose eyes by this time had turned yellow with hate and whose ears had been laid out flat, Charlie seized an ear and sank his teeth in it, and then, with wild howls of rage in both English and Crow, he grabbed the nostrils with thumb and fingers and tried to tear the nose off. With a moccasin foot, he delivered a blow at the beast's ribs, and so wrenched his big toe that he screamed with pain and fury, and then smote the mule's ribs with both fists. By this time the beast had sunk to his hind end and was sitting like a creature determined to sit forever. Charlie ran back 10 paces, swung, rushed at the mule, and with all his might heaved himself against it, trying to knock it over. By this time several men were shouting encouragement to Charlie, who, with a badly sprained toe, bruised hands, a slobbering mouth, and bulging eyes wild with bloodshot, was looking desperately but blindly round him, as though for a crane or derrick. He next worked at right angles to the beast, both right and left. Surging forward with a rope, he would yank the mule's head around and try to topple him over, and then run in the other direction and try to spill him that way. But the mule by this time had his rump flat on the ground and his front feet spread. If Charlie had left him alone, he probably would have sat there for hours. After all his furious and futile effort, Charlie was so possessed by insane rage that he turned his eyes, bloodshot and filled with sweat, on his rifle. Seizing it, he ran cursing to the beast, thrust the muzzle against the skull, and pulled the trigger. The forelegs collapsed. The mule then rested on its belly, with its big bony head laid out on the earth. About noon, Sam slipped into Charlie's hideout. Charlie, like all mountain men who spent a part of their time hiding and watching for the enemy, had heard Sam coming and was waiting for him, concealed, left elbow on left knee, rifle cocked and aimed at the sound. Sam was only 50 feet from him when Charlie stepped forth. Then in his awkward, loose-limbed, shuffling gait, he came forward, his eyes bugged out with suspicion and welcome, his tongue saying,
"Well now, if it ain't you, I thought maybe you was one of them Whigs, and danged if I can stand a Whig. I heard you got rubbed out down on Santa Fe."
The words revealed to Sam a part of what he wanted to know. He had never been down on the Santa Fe, and Charlie had no reason to believe that he had. According to Sam's reasoning, the words said that Charlie knew that Sam had been far south, and that this past winter he had possibly been killed. Who could have told him that except the crows? "Who said I was on the Santa Fe?"
"I don't rightly recollect,"
Charlie said.
"Well, doggone your buckskin, get down and smoke a peace pipe."
A woman had come forward from her hiding place in the trees, a crow, with narrow forehead, high cheekbones, eyes too close together, heavy lips and chin. She looked young, but over-fat, unclean, and stupid.
"Where you off to?"
asked Charlie, looking up at Sam, who still sat on his horse.
"And cuss my forked tongue, ain't this McBoon's Bay?"
"You might be right," Sam said.
"I heard Mick loves his horse more'n himself."
"Just borrowed it," Sam said. He thought it best to force Charlie to do most of the talking. Dismounting, he put his rifle in its buckskin harness, led the bay and pack horse over to trees and hitched them, and turned, his pipe and tobacco in his hands. "All right, let's have the pipe of peace." Charlie was no fool. His intuitions were quick and sharp. Sensing the double meaning in Sam's words, he must have decided to lay his cards on the table, for he now said,
"Heard you had a woman. Where is she?"
Sam was tamping his pipe. He now met Charlie's pale blue gaze, and the two men looked into the eyes of one another a long moment. "Who told you?" Sam said.
"Don't recollect that neither. Might have been Bill, might have been Hank."
Sam looked up at the squaw, who was ready with a live ember. Both men sucked flame into their pipes and smoke into their lungs. Blue streams of smoke out through nostrils and between lips, looked again into one another's eyes, and pressed the burning tobacco down in the bowls. Deciding that it was useless to fence with this sly, treacherous man, and not much caring whether he learned a lot or a little, Sam said, "Dead. The crows killed her." In that moment, Sam looked at Charlie's eyes, but Charlie was suddenly busy with his pipe. Then for an instant he met Sam's gaze and said,
"Crows? You mean the sparrowhawks? I find that unreasonable, Sam."
After half a minute, while both men smoked, Charlie said,
"Who told you?"
"Moccasins." During the 5 minutes they had been sitting by the fire, smoking and sparring, Sam had observed the position of Charlie's weapons and of his squaw. At his waist, Charlie had a revolver and a knife. His rifle was about 8 feet behind him, leaning against camp trappings, and a wood hatchet lay within reach of his right hand. On sitting, Sam hadn't loosened his knife in its sheath. If he had to fight, he didn't intend to use a knife. He had been aware from the first that he might have to fight, for it was well known over the whole Crow country that Charlie was a friend of the Crows and an unpredictable man. He could blow hot and turn murderous in an instant. The squaw stood at Charlie's right and a little back. Her right foot was only 18 inches from the hatchet. "It wasn't only my wife," Sam said. "My unborn son, too." Charlie again tinkered with his pipe. It was all his sense of the proper could bear to hear a white man call a red Injun his wife. But the son! Half-breed children were, for him, a species of animal only slightly above the greaser. With a thin smile in his beard that was close to a smirk, Charlie said, "Just how on earth could you tell it was a son?" "The pelvic bones," Sam said. He had been keeping his eye on the squaw. He knew that she had never taken her black gaze off him, and he wondered if she had a knife hidden in her leather clothing. Charlie was puffing at his pipe and looking at Sam. Sam decided that he might as well say what he had come to say. "I figured you might know who it was," he said.
"Well, now,"
said Charlie, taking the pipe from his yellow teeth.
"Doggone it, Sam.
How would I know?"
"It was the Rapahoes, if you ask me."
"It was the Sparrowhawks," Sam said, using that word instead of Crows so that Charlie wouldn't boil over. "I expect I'll take my vengeance, and I thought they just as well know it. I thought maybe you'd like to tell them. You can tell them this, if you want to, that if the ones who did it will come out and face me 3 at a time, all of us with no weapons, I'll leave the others alone. If the chief won't send the murderers out, I intend to make war on the whole nation." Charlie took the pipe away from his teeth and left his mouth open.
"The whole nation? Just you?"
"Just me," Sam said.
"So that's why you have Mix Bay."
"Maybe." Sam rose to his feet. "I figure the sooner you let the chief know, the better it will be. I don't intend to give him much time for medicine and powwows." Charlie stood up.
"Well, now, Sam, ain't you a little unreasonable? The Sparrowhawks are good fighters. You know that. I figure you'll be gone beaver almost before you get to the Yellowstone."
"I might be gone beaver before the next Canada geese come over, but there will be some bones for the wolves to pick. And don't forget to tell the chief that I leave my mark. I don't want anyone blamed for what I do."
"A mark?"
said Charlie, looking at Sam. He seemed fascinated.
"And what," he asked softly, "will the mark be?"
"I'll take the right ear."
"The right ear?"
said Charlie, staring. "Besides the scalp," Sam said.
"Well, I'll be doggone,"
said Charlie. Chapter 13. It was 4 red men that he saw sitting by a campfire after dark, 3 days after he had left Charlie. Sam had sensed the presence of Indians an hour earlier and had hidden his beasts in a thicket and gone forward as the wolf goes. Among white men of the West, the scout was known as the wolf. On each foot he had 3 moccasins of different sizes. He thought a small war party was there by the fire, on its way to another tribe, to steal horses and take scalps, or that it was returning with a scalp or two at its belt. The warriors would be smoking their pipes and thinking of themselves as very brave men. Perhaps they had feasted on buffalo loin. If their bellies were full, they might be a little sleepy. As soundless as the wolf, Sam went forward. When a half-mile away, he could tell that the party was encamped on a small stream that flowed down a hillside through an aspen thicket. To the left was a tableland, from which he hoped to get a clear view of the camp. On reaching this, he was delighted. The 4 warriors, sitting by a fire, were in plain view in a small clearing by the stream bank. It was a poor campsite for men who expected to see the next sunrise, but they probably thought there would be no enemies in this area so early in the season. The mountain men would be heading for the posts with their packs. The red men would be feeling only half alive after the long cold winter. Sam stood in full view of them, but he knew that in the dark they couldn't see him. He wished that somehow the Almighty could let him know if these were the men who had killed his wife and child. Wondering if Charlie had taken the message to the chief, he studied the physical situation below and around him until he knew the nature of the soil and plant life. It was still early spring. The old grasses and weeds along the stream and above the patches of snow were sere and whispering like a million insects. It wouldn't be easy to make a soundless approach through such grass, but the soil was in his favor, for it was moist and soft. His 3 layers of moccasin skin would sink against it as if it were cotton. To learn if there were more than 4 of them, Sam became a man who, to the impartial observer, would hardly have seemed human. He had drawn on his 5 senses for all the information they could give him, and was now like a man intently listening, though actually he was consulting what he thought of as his danger sense. His physical posture was exactly that of the wolf when it felt itself in the presence of an enemy and stood stock still, trying to measure the danger. Sam now doubled back a mile and scouted the area east and north of the camp. He thought it unlikely that there were other Indians within miles of this spot, but the men who had accepted the unlikely as fact were all dead. He went 2 miles east by north, striding swiftly but softly along the crests of aspen-covered hills. Time and again he stopped to listen and sniff. After 2 hours of reconnoitering, he knew the direction from which these warriors had come and the direction in which they were headed. He knew they had no horses, no dog, no fresh scalps, and that they were the kind of party that had killed his wife. If only the one who struck Lotus down were there. He came back down the hills and took a position south of the camp. His revolvers he had hidden near his horses. His rifle he now set by a tree, and he adjusted the bowie sheath on the left side of his belt, 2 inches forward from his hip bone, so that he could seize it instantly. Then he went forward. For 250 yards he followed a buffalo path along a stream. A strong breeze was blowing against him. The odor of the campfire and of the 4 men around it was in his nostrils. How well he knew that crow odor! 100 yards from the men he stopped and stood a few moments, sensing. One of them seemed to be lying on his robe. The other 3 still sat and smoked, with dying firelight playing over the face of the one on the north side. Sam wished that he was the one lying down. The warrior facing him seemed to have no sense of danger. He didn't peer into the dark or listen or glance round him. Sam knew he could advance no farther as long as the man sat there. He would have to wait. While waiting, he again went over his plan. At the instant when he was ready to strike the first blow, he would give the dreadful crow battle cry. With all the power of his lungs, he would explode it in their ears. A sliver of moon had come up. It cast a little light, but not much. There was a little light from the fire, but he could no longer see the Indian's face. An hour later, the last of the four had lain down. Again, Sam went over his plan. When 6 feet from the man lying on the south side, he would give the cry, with enough rage in it to arouse the dead. At the same moment he would paralyze the man with his right heel. The next instant he would smite with his clenched fist the man on the east side, and swing and bury his knife in the man on the west side. The man on the north side might by that time be on his feet. Sam's plan was to seize him by the throat and with one powerful wrench snap his spine. He figured the whole thing would take no more than 7 seconds. He began to move forward. Against the moist earth, his moccasins made no sound, but he had to move with extreme care when thrusting a foot forward through the dead grass. He supposed that the 4 of them were now asleep. They were dreaming dreams of murder and bloody scalps, and young women wildly acclaiming them. When 30 feet from them, Sam paused to study their positions. Then he crept forward until he stood almost above the man on the south side. He took a few moments to settle his big tensed body into quiet. Then he soundlessly inhaled air until his lungs were filled, and in the next moment exploded it. Hook-I-hi! The sound shattered the night. The man next to him had no time to move before a tremendous blow paralyzed him. The man on the east was struggling to sit up when Sam drove his fist against his windpipe. A moment later, the 12-inch blade went all the way through the chest of the man on the west side, who at that moment was on his knees, reaching around him. The man on the north was on his feet, as Sam had expected him to be, and was making a move to flee when Sam's huge hands closed round his throat. Sam heard the neck snap and released it, and at the same moment, with a thrust of his foot, struck the man in his belly and sent him plunging for 15 feet. His next move was to draw the knife from the man and plunge it through the heart of each of the 2 he had knocked unconscious. With the skill of one who had studied the work of professionals, he took the 4 scalps and cut off the right ears. He looked at the dead men, but none of them seemed to have Lotus's bowie. Then he hastened to his rifle. There he waited. If there were other warriors in the area who had heard his cry, they would come slinking and skulking, their black eyes like jewels in the moonlight. But no warriors came. Settling the scalps and ears in the forks of a tree, Sam took his rifle and went to the bodies to see if on them or in their trappings there was any sign of his wife, her scalp, or a utensil, or a weapon. He could find none. Taking each by an ankle, he dragged the corpses into position, side by side, and flung their weapons across them. If other warriors found these bodies before the wolves got to them, they would see that the right ears had been sliced off close to the skulls. They would know that Sam Menard had left his mark. Returning to his horses, he rolled into a robe for 3 or 4 hours of sleep. His last thoughts before the night closed over him were of his wife, whose bones, in the blanket behind the saddle, were within reach of his hand.